On May 24, 2011, a 104-year-old woman died in a hospital room in New York City. She had not seen the outside world in 2 decades. She had not set foot in any of her 5 homes, mansions that together contained 98 rooms, 23 bathrooms, and enough space to shelter hundreds. In over 20 years, she owned a 23-room apartment overlooking Central Park that she had not entered since 1991. She owned a 42-room Connecticut estate with a private lake and a mile of shoreline that sat empty, its curtains drawn against a world its owner refused to see. She owned a California chateau modeled after a Loire Valley castle, complete with a dollhouse museum and a private beach where the staff maintained the grounds for a mistress who never came. Her name was Huguette Marcel Clark, and when she died, she was worth $300 million. She had not spoken to her family in decades. Her only regular human contact was with nurses, accountants, and a private duty caregiver who brought her the one thing that seemed to matter anymore: new dolls to add to her collection. This is not a story about wealth. It is a story about what happens when money becomes a substitute for human connection and fails. Huguette Clark was born on June 9, 1906, in Paris, France, into a world that most people could not even imagine. Her father, William Andrews Clark, was one of the 50 richest Americans who ever lived, a copper magnate, senator, and robber baron who had built his fortune extracting metal from the earth and power from the political system. He owned banks, railroads, newspapers, and a 134-room mansion on Fifth Avenue, so enormous it required its own zip code. He had married twice, fathered 10 children, and treated human beings, including his own family, as assets to be managed, displayed, or discarded according to their utility. Huguette was his youngest child, born when he was 67 years old, and his wife Anna was 23. She was not so much a daughter as she was a late-life accessory, a beautiful, delicate object to be kept in the gilded cage of his final years. The Clark mansion on Fifth Avenue was less a home than a monument to conquest. Marble imported from Italy covered every surface. A pipe organ with 7,000 pipes filled the ballroom with music no one truly listened to. Paintings by Rembrandt and Rubens hung in hallways, so long servants got lost navigating them, and in the center of this excess moved a small, quiet girl who learned early that love in this house was conditional on performance. Huguette was expected to be seen but not heard, to be beautiful but not demanding, to appreciate her father's generosity without ever asking for more than he chose to give. William Clark died when Huguette was 16 years old. His will left her a trust fund worth the equivalent of $60 million in today's dollars, not because he loved her particularly, but because that was what one did with surplus daughters in families of his stature. The money arrived with no instructions, no guidance, no human hand to help her understand what to do with a fortune that had been built on ruthless extraction and now belonged to a girl who flinched at raised voices. She tried, at first, to live the life expected of her. In her 20s, Huguette married a graphic designer named William MacDonald in a quiet ceremony that scandalized New York society. He was not from old money. He had no title, no inheritance, no useful connections. He was simply a man she had met and apparently liked. The marriage lasted 2 years. No official reason was ever given for the divorce. But those close to the situation whispered that William had made the fatal error of treating Huguette like a person rather than a possession, that he had expected intimacy, conversation, partnership. He had asked questions about her inner life. He had wanted to know what she thought, what she felt, what she wanted. And Huguette, who had been raised by servants and educated by tutors but never truly known by another human being, had no answer to give him. The divorce was amicable. William received a settlement. Huguette retreated back into the mansion on Fifth Avenue, which was soon demolished to make way for luxury apartments, a fitting metaphor for what would become of her life. Beautiful structures built for display, then torn down and replaced, leaving no trace of what had once occupied the space. By her 30s, Huguette had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. She moved into a 12th-floor apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, a modest space by Clark standards, just 4,000 square feet, with her mother, Anna. The two women lived together in increasing isolation, surrounded by art and antiques they rarely looked at, attended by staff who handled every practical detail of existence. Huguette painted watercolors of flowers and dolls. She collected Japanese art with the obsessive focus of someone trying to fill an emptiness she could not name. She never remarried. She never had children. She attended almost no social events. When she did venture out, to an art auction, to a doctor's appointment, she wore heavy veils and large hats, as if trying to erase her own face from the world's view. Her mother died in 1963. Huguette was 57 years old. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. And instead of reaching outward, toward family, toward friends, toward the world, she turned further inward. She began what would become a 48-year retreat from human contact. The mechanics of her isolation were precise and deliberate. She moved from the Fifth Avenue apartment to a hospital room at Doctor's Hospital on the Upper East Side, not because she was ill, but because hospitals offered something her mansions could not: constant, predictable human presence without the demand for emotional reciprocity. Nurses came on schedule. They performed tasks. They asked minimal questions. They did not expect conversation or friendship or vulnerability. For Huguette, this transactional care was safer than the messy unpredictability of genuine relationship. She paid $800 a day for the room, a fortune for a space she could have owned outright, but ownership would have required decisions, maintenance, presence. Paying rent meant she could remain a guest in her own life, never fully settling anywhere, never fully committing to any place or person. The staff at Doctor's Hospital learned to accommodate her eccentricities. She requested specific brands of soap. She demanded the room temperature be kept at exactly 72 degrees. She asked nurses to purchase dolls for her collection, antique French bisque dolls with porcelain faces that never changed expression, never made demands, never left. Meanwhile, her properties sat empty. Belosguardo, the 23-acre Santa Barbara estate with ocean views and a 22,000-square-foot mansion, remained shuttered for decades. The staff of 12 continued to maintain it. Mowing lawns, no one walked on; dusting furniture, no one sat on; changing the water in fountains, no one listened to, because Huguette insisted it be kept ready for her arrival. That arrival never came. In Connecticut, her 42-room country estate, Le Beau Chateau, sat in similar suspension. The swimming pool was cleaned weekly. The gardens were manicured to perfection. The kitchen was stocked with fresh food in case she decided to visit. She never did. In New York, her 23-room apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue gathered dust behind locked doors. Artworks worth millions hung on walls that saw no eyes, but the occasional security guards. These were not homes. They were monuments to a life that had been abandoned, the physical manifestation of wealth without purpose, space without occupancy, possession without presence. Her family tried at first to maintain contact. Distant cousins, descendants of her father's first marriage, reached out on holidays. They sent letters that went unanswered. They made phone calls that were never returned. They visited the hospital only to be told by staff that Huguette was not receiving visitors today, a phrase that became permanent policy. By the 1990s, the family had largely given up. They assumed she had simply chosen solitude. What they did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Huguette's isolation was not entirely voluntary. In her 80s, she had become the subject of what would later be called elder financial exploitation. A private duty nurse named Hadassah Perry began working for Huguette in the late 1980s. Within years, Hadassah was receiving gifts totaling over $30 million. Apartment buildings, cash transfers, jewelry, while Huguette remained in her hospital room, unaware or unable to stop the flow of assets. Accountants and lawyers who should have protected her instead facilitated the transfers, accepting their own gifts and fees, while the world's richest recluse signed documents she may not have fully understood. The system designed to protect the vulnerable had failed her completely, not because she lacked money, but because money without relationship is just a resource to be extracted by those with proximity and power. Yet even as her fortune was being quietly dismantled, Huguette maintained one form of agency: her art. In the hospital room that became her world, she painted hundreds of watercolors, delicate, precise renderings of flowers, of dolls, of imaginary landscapes that existed only in her mind. The paintings were technically skilled but emotionally restrained, like their creator. They revealed nothing of loneliness, nothing of regret, nothing of the woman who had owned everything and touched almost nothing. She gave these paintings away, to nurses, to hospital staff, to anyone who showed her basic kindness. A painting that might have sold for thousands at auction was handed to a janitor who had remembered how she liked her tea. This was not generosity in the usual sense. It was transaction, a painting for a kindness, a gift for a moment of human attention. She had learned early that everything had a price, including connection. And she was willing to pay. The outside world occasionally intruded. In 2004, a distant cousin named Paul Clark attempted to establish contact, concerned about reports of exploitation. Huguette's lawyers blocked him at every turn. In 2005, she was declared legally competent after a brief examination, a determination that would later be questioned given her extreme isolation and apparent cognitive decline. In 2010, at age 104, she signed a will that left nothing to her family and $34 million to create an arts center at Bello Sguardo, the Santa Barbara estate she had not visited in 40 years. The will also left millions to her accountant, her attorney, her night nurse, and the hospital where she lived. Her family contested the will, arguing she had been manipulated by those surrounding her in her final years. The legal battle would continue long after her death, but Huguette would never know. She had retreated so completely from the world that even the disposition of her fortune, her last remaining connection to power, happened without her meaningful participation. What did she think about during those decades alone? The question has no answer, because Huguette left almost no written record of her inner life, no diaries, no personal letters, no interviews. She was the richest woman in America for much of her later life, yet she remains one of its most unknowable figures. We can only infer from what she did. She collected dolls with frozen expressions, because real faces demanded responses she could not give. She maintained empty mansions because occupancy would have required her to confront the question of what home actually means. She paid strangers to care for her because family required a history she could not bear to revisit. She gave away millions while living in a hospital room because money had long since stopped meaning anything except the ability to purchase moments of transaction. The tragedy was not that she was unloved. The tragedy was that she had been loved so poorly in childhood, treated as an object in her father's collection, that she never learned how to receive or offer genuine connection. Wealth could purchase every material comfort, but it could not rewire a nervous system trained from infancy to expect abandonment. Consider the central paradox of her existence. She owned enough real estate to house thousands, yet she chose to live in a single hospital room barely larger than a closet. She could have hired the world's finest chefs, yet she ate institutional food from plastic trays. She could have traveled anywhere on private jets, yet she had not seen sunlight directly for decades. This was not eccentricity. This was the logical endpoint of a life that had learned wealth solves nothing that matters. A child, raised without genuine affection, does not suddenly discover how to love at 57 or 77 or 90. A person taught that relationships are transactions does not suddenly learn intimacy after a lifetime of isolation. Huguette's retreat was not a rejection of the world so much as an acknowledgement that she had never been equipped to live in it. The hospital room was not a prison. It was the first space in her life that made no demands on her. To be charming, to be grateful, to be present, to be anything other than a body requiring basic maintenance. In that sterile room, she was finally free from performance. And freedom, for someone who had only ever known performance, looked indistinguishable from surrender. The exploitation she suffered in her final decades reveals something uncomfortable about American wealth. That money without relationship creates vulnerability rather than power. A woman with $300 million could be manipulated by a nurse making $20 an hour, not because she was unintelligent, but because intelligence cannot compensate for a lifetime of emotional deprivation. She had no one to call when she felt confused, no one to question the documents placed before her, no one who loved her enough to intervene when the pattern of gifts became alarming. Her family had been kept at such a distance for so long that by the time they realized something was wrong, the legal mechanisms to protect her had already been circumvented. The very isolation that had felt like safety became the condition for her exploitation. And this is perhaps the deepest irony of inherited wealth. It can purchase every form of security except the one that matters most, the security of being truly known and protected by people who care more about your well-being than your assets. When Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011, the hospital staff who had cared for her for decades were the only mourners present. There were no family members at her bedside, no friends, no one who had known her as a child, as a young woman, as anything other than the reclusive heiress in room 5B. Her body was claimed by representatives of her estate. The funeral was private, attended by a handful of people who had been paid to be there. The mansions remained empty. The legal battles over her fortune intensified, and the world moved on, briefly fascinated by the story of the richest recluse, then forgetting her as quickly as she had forgotten the world. The $300 million she left behind was divided among nurses, lawyers, accountants, and a foundation that would eventually, after years of litigation, fulfill her wish to create an arts center at the Santa Barbara estate she had never seen. The money would do good things. It would fund exhibitions, support artists, preserve a beautiful property. But none of it would answer the question that hung over her life like a ghost. What is wealth for, if not to purchase the one thing it cannot buy? There is a photograph of Huguette Clark taken in 1930, when she was 24 years old. She stands in the garden of her family's Paris apartment, wearing an elegant white dress, holding a parasol. Her expression is not quite as... It is something more complicated, a careful arrangement of features designed to project serenity while revealing nothing beneath. Her eyes do not engage with the camera. They look slightly past it, as if already practicing the art of disappearance that would define her later life. She's beautiful in the way expensive objects are beautiful, polished, symmetrical, designed to be observed rather than known. Standing beside her is her mother, Anna, whose hand rests lightly on Huguette's shoulder, a gesture meant to read as maternal affection in the photograph, but which in reality was likely as performative as everything else in their lives. This single image contains the entire tragedy of Huguette Clark, a woman surrounded by beauty and privilege, touched by a mother's hand, and already alone. The photograph was taken 80 years before her death, and in all that time nothing fundamental changed. She remained the girl in the garden, observed, displayed, preserved, but never truly. The mansions she left behind have since been repurposed. Bello Sguardo now operates as a public arts center, its rooms filled with visitors who walk through spaces Huguette never entered, admiring views she never saw. Tourists take photographs in the ballroom where no ball was ever held, sit on benches overlooking the ocean she never watched. The Connecticut estate was sold to a billionaire who renovated it beyond recognition. The New York apartment was subdivided into luxury condos purchased by financiers who know nothing of the woman who once owned them. These transformations are fitting. Huguette's homes were never truly homes. They were containers for a life that refused to be lived, and when a space has never contained genuine living, it can be remade without loss, like an empty vase that held no flowers, a frame with no painting, a shell with no creature inside. The emptiness was the point all. We tell ourselves stories about wealth as protection, that money shields us from life's cruelties, that it purchases safety, that it guarantees we will never be alone. Huguette Clark's life demonstrates the opposite truth, that wealth without connection amplifies loneliness rather than curing it. A poor person alone in a studio apartment may still have neighbors who notice their absence, a landlord who checks when rent is late, a community that would sound an alarm if they disappeared. But a billionaire alone in a hospital room surrounded by paid staff can vanish emotionally for decades without triggering any system of care, because every interaction has been monetized, every relationship made transactional, every human connection reduced to a service with a price tag. The ultimate luxury Huguette purchased was not privacy. It was irrelevance. She arranged her life so completely around money that when money became the only mediator of human contact, she ceased to exist as a person to anyone outside her immediate circle of paid attention. And a person who exists only as a source of payment is not really a person at all. There is no villain in this story. Not really. Her father loved as he knew how, through provision rather than presence. Her mother maintained the social performance required of women in her position. The nurses and lawyers who received her millions were not monsters. They were human beings responding to proximity and opportunity in a system that rewards extraction. Even Huguette herself cannot be blamed for her isolation. How do you learn to love when no one has ever modeled it for you? How do you build intimacy when your earliest lessons taught you that people leave? That affection is conditional, that your value lies in what you own rather than who you are. She did not choose loneliness. She inherited its blueprint from a father who treated human beings as assets, and she spent a century trying to live inside a structure that had no foundation for genuine connection. The tragedy is not that she failed. The tragedy is that no one ever showed her another way was possible. In her final years, Huguette developed a habit of watching cartoons on television. Simple animations with clear morals and happy endings. She would sit for hours in her hospital room, the glow of the screen illuminating a face that had not seen direct sunlight in decades, watching stories where kindness was rewarded and loneliness was always temporary. It is tempting to interpret this as childish regression, but perhaps it was something more profound, a hunger for narratives where connection is possible, where people stay, where love is not a transaction but a given. The cartoons offered what her life never had, a world where being alone was not a permanent condition, but a temporary state before rescue arrived. She watched them, not because she had become simple, but because she was starved for simplicity. Not because she had lost her mind, but because her mind had spent 80 years navigating a complexity no human should have to face. How to be a person when you have only ever been treated as a possession. When the end came, it was quiet. No dramatic final words, no deathbed reconciliations. No family gathered to offer forgiveness or receive it. Just a 104-year-old woman in a hospital room, surrounded by people who were paid to be there, dying as she had lived, alone despite being watched, wealthy despite being empty, present in body but absent in every way that constitutes a life. The nurses who found her that morning noted that her face was peaceful, and perhaps it was. Perhaps in those final moments the performance finally ended. Perhaps for the first time since childhood she was not playing a role, not the dutiful daughter, not the reclusive heiress, not the eccentric billionaire, but simply a human being releasing the exhausting work of being someone she was never allowed to become. Peace is not always happiness. Sometimes peace is just the absence of struggle. And Huguette Clark had struggled her entire life against a truth she could never escape, that you cannot spend your way out of a childhood without love. Her legacy is complicated. The Arts Center at Bellosguardo now hosts exhibitions that draw thousands. The legal battles over her estate exposed elder exploitation and led to reforms in how New York handles cases of isolated wealthy seniors. Her story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme isolation in old age. But these outcomes feel incidental, byproducts of a life that was never about contribution or legacy or meaning. Huguette Clark did not set out to change the world. She set out to survive it, and in her own way, she succeeded. She survived childhood in a gilded cage. She survived a society that had no place for quiet women who refused to perform femininity for public consumption. She survived old age in a culture that discards the elderly. She survived by withdrawing so completely that the world could not touch her. The cost of that survival was everything that makes survival worthwhile. But from where she stood, alone in a hospital room at 104, having outlived everyone who might have loved her, that cost may have seemed worth paying. We are fascinated by stories like Huguette's not because they are unusual, but because they reveal a universal fear that our achievements, our possessions, our carefully constructed lives might prove meaningless in the face of fundamental human needs. We accumulate wealth hoping it will protect us from the vulnerabilities of being human, rejection, abandonment, irrelevance. But Huguette Clark had more protection than almost anyone who has ever lived, and it failed her completely. Not because money is worthless, but because money answers the wrong questions. It can tell you how much something costs. It cannot tell you what something means. It can purchase a mansion with 98 rooms, It cannot purchase a single room where you feel you belong. It can hire nurses to monitor your vital. It cannot hire someone to notice when your soul has left the building. Huguette's life was not a failure of wealth. It was a demonstration of wealth's limits. And in an era of curated perfection, of social media performance, of relationships reduced to networking opportunities, her story resonates because we recognize the pattern. The more we substitute transaction for connection, the more we risk building lives that are impressive to observe but empty to inhabit. The final irony is this: Huguette Clark's greatest act of agency may have been her withdrawal itself. In a world that had always treated her as an object to be displayed, first as William Clark's youngest daughter, then as a society heiress, then as America's richest recluse, her refusal to participate was the one choice that remained entirely her own. She could not undo her childhood. She could not learn to love late in life. She could not transform transactional relationships into genuine ones. But she could disappear. She could retreat into a room where no one could photograph her, judge her, or demand anything from her. She could choose absence over a presence that had always been performative. We call this tragedy, and it was. But it was also resistance. The quiet, devastating resistance of a woman who decided that if she could not have a real life, she would not have a fake one either. She would not pretend to enjoy parties she hated. She would not maintain friendships that were really business arrangements. She would not smile for cameras when no one cared what lay behind the smile. She would simply stop. And in stopping, she exposed the hollowness of everything around her, the mansions built for show, the social rituals performed without meaning, the entire edifice of old money New York that had nothing to offer a human soul in need of genuine connection. She died alone. But then, she had been alone her entire life. The money had never changed that. The mansions had never changed. The decades of isolation had only made visible what had always been true. And perhaps that is the real disturbance in Huguette Clark's story. Not that a rich woman died alone, but that wealth had nothing to say to the oldest human problem: how to be truly known and to know another before the light goes out for the final. On May